I'm Jon Krosnick, professor at Stanford University in the departments of communication, psychology, political science, and sustainability.
And I'm Gary Langer, president of Langer Research Associates. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon in the midst of a thriving APOR conference to celebrate the life and accomplishment and views of one of the greats of survey research, Gary Langer. It's an honor to be on the stage with him, and I'll just begin by noting a few of the many ways in which his work and recognitions have been, I'll begin by noting just a few ways in which his work and accomplishments have been recognized. In addition to 2 Emmy Awards and 10 nominations for Emmys, he is a recipient of the Policy Impact Award from APOR, as well as the David Ogilvy Award for Excellence in Advertising Research. He won Gallup Awards twice for excellent journalism using polls, as well as the National Council on Public Polls Award and others as well. And I've been told that our goal during this conversation today is to bring to life Gary's journey as a professional and his perspectives on the field. So that's what we're going to do. So I have questions to begin by asking you about that journey to start. And so you were a journalist early in life and transitioned to becoming a scientist, and today are one of the few most important leading scientists doing our work on this planet, and recognized as such very broadly. So if you could, for young people who are beginning careers and thinking about their own directions, how did you make it into this field from not being in it?
Well, I first want to say you're overselling me slightly, John, but I appreciate it very much. I came into this field through pure serendipity, which is kind of a great way to come into any field, I think, which is to keep your eyes open and keep your mind open and find what fascinates you and go in that direction. All I wanted to be as a kid growing up was a newsman. I wanted to be a reporter. And that was even a pre-Watergate ambition of mine. And son of a gun, I became a reporter. I was a reporter for the Associated Press. Started in Concord, New Hampshire, spent 3 years there, and then 7 years as an AP reporter in New York. Train wrecks, plane crashes, 3-alarm fires, you name it. But the AP, on top of other things, had some investigative work that came my way. I was kind of a guy who could handle a little detail, and some data-oriented work that came my way. Anything kind of over 2 inches thick that came in over the transom would land on my desk. AP had a little poll they ran, a consumer survey they called it. It was kind of nonsense, but the guy ran it left, and they asked me to run it because I was maybe the only guy there who was not truly math phobic, right? There's a lot of English majors in the journalism business. And I studied it up. I met with leading pollsters of the day to learn more about their work. I remember a martini-soaked lunch with Bud Lewis of the LA Times, among others, and was fascinated and warmly welcomed by these guys who really were interested in encouraging to me and learning more about survey research practice. I took a course, maybe a week-long course with George Marcus at Williams College, and I found it really interesting. My 10 years of reporting at the Associated Press, you go as deep as you can, but not all that deep, because there's a lot of ground to cover as a general assignment reporter. This was a place we could dive in and really learn a lot. I'd also say, you know, as a newsman at the Associated Press, I wrote news stories, tell stories with words. I used to file for radio, tell stories with sounds. I went to work for ABC, you tell stories with pictures. In the survey research world, we tell stories with numbers, but at the end of the day, what's most important about it to me is that it's not about the words or the sounds or the pictures or the numbers, it's about the story. And that's kind of been the focus of my career, is that storytelling piece supported by good data.
And the fact is that for me as a university professor, what's remarkable for professors is that we are hired to teach, and we're never taught to teach. Actually, when we get PhDs, we are taught to do research. And we've got to go, we're thrown in the ocean, and we begin swimming to try to figure out how to handle students. Yeah. Was journalism like that for you? Or did you look over the shoulders of people? Did editors tell you what to do? How did you learn to be a storyteller?
Oh, a little of both. So one is, in high school, there was a teacher I had, a social studies teacher who was wonderful, and her best friend was a German teacher. I didn't take German, but her son was a professor at the University of New Hampshire. And UNH had a really unique journalism program in which you would be placed for a full semester, full-time, working at a local newspaper, one of 3 or 4 newspapers in Massachusetts. It was a great opportunity for hands-on experience, and that alone is why I applied to and went to the University of New Hampshire, to get that practical experience. It seemed like it would be super important. On top of that, there were a couple of people I worked with over the years, particularly as a reporter, who are there every day over my shoulder, looking over the work I'm doing, encouraging me to dig deeper, to find the right word, to do the right analysis, to try harder, to keep at it. Adolph Bernotis of the Associated Press, a colleague of mine in Concord. I was as a kid when I started there, on the overnight shift, the late night shift. I used to write through the night, radio summaries and the rest, and roll them up, the printout at the end of the day, and stick them in Adolph's mailbox. He'd come in the morning, I was long gone, home asleep. He'd go through it and mark it up for me, roll it back up, stick it in my mailbox. I'd find it when I came in that night, and he was a wonderful mentor. The other guy was a news anchor at ABC News named Peter Jennings. And again, Peter is over my shoulder every day. I can hear him just picking at it to get it right, to try harder, to dig deeper.
Okay, and so today, when you write on so many different topics, you write about politics, but you write about many other topics as well. Are there principles that guide your storytelling? How do you figure out what is the important story from this set of numbers?
Well, this is a key piece, the analytical piece. First of all, you have to learn about the topic you're covering. And in my company, our research clients are frequently more deeply versed in the topics we're covering, and I learn from them. I learn a lot from them about what they know about the issue they want us to study. We look up existing research, we do desk reviews, and we do everything we can to absorb the essential background to inform our judgment going forward. Anyone who thinks you can do a survey by just sort of picking up a piece of paper and writing a questionnaire is really missing the boat, because we can't and shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel. We have to learn what came before, assess it, find what's good about it, find what's not so good about it, and build forward from there to extend and expand our knowledge base. And that's one critical piece, is knowing the background. Analytically, and this is something I look for in the colleagues I work with at my company, I really like to think laterally, not just horizontally, if you will. A lot of people will have deep expertise, perhaps in statistical analysis or in a particular given topic, and can drill very deep, but often don't even think to look out over the horizon. And adding context to the stories we want to tell through associated data, related data, digging deeply, it's all got to be data supported. It's got to be empirically justified and stand up to scrutiny. But looking out broadly over the horizon, we just did an analysis about the current presidential race in an ABC survey. We pulled in data back to Harry Truman to try to help tell the story and put it in context. Too often, you'll get your data set and you won't look beyond it, and that's a real missed opportunity, I'd suggest.
Got it. Okay. Let's talk about the evolution of the methods that you have watched and used. So think about, if you would, years ago, in what phase of survey research was the method of collecting and analyzing data the best and the easiest and the most reliable?
Well, those are different questions between the best and the easiest and the most reliable. At AP, that little consumer survey I mentioned was highly problematic in terms of its structure. It was sort of the advertising department of a newspaper in Virginia, who was sort of in off hours would make phone calls. I'm still not sure where they got the sample. We professionalized it from there. But in those days, in the early days at ABC, we were doing landline samples, cell-based weighting, 48-cell matrix, the kind of old-fashioned, not that old-fashioned, but still fairly old-fashioned stuff. Adaptation became necessary over the years, of course. We started getting shortfalls in the application of cell-based weighting, and it made a lot of sense to move to raking. We moved from, I think we might have been, I'm trying to remember the respondent selection method we used at the time. I was going to say it might have been Waxberg-Matovsky. It was a little complicated at the start, but we adapted that again and did some testing over time. And of course, ultimately made the move to cell phone interviews. And now our last couple of surveys with ABC have been on probability-based online panels. So we adapt over time and we leverage the technology we have, right? We started with somewhat antiquated data analysis systems, and then we have SPSS or Stata or SAS. Now we have R. I imagine AI is going to be coming around. We can make great use of these tools. We just have to stay open to them and make sure we use them appropriately.
So you just described probability sampling through your career, shifting from phone to online. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the profession has used other methods. The federal government has been doing face-to-face interviewing for decades, as have some academic surveys. And recently, there have been various different versions of online data collection as well. Comment about that shift of modes, if you would.
Sure, and a lot of it is situational. We ourselves do a fairly substantial amount of face-to-face survey research in other countries. We've got a pretty busy international practice. We just handed in surveys from 20 countries. We're currently going into the field in a dozen more, and a bunch of them are face-to-face. But what's nice about face-to-face in terms of leveraging technology is we can now use GPS to track our interviewers and make sure they're en route. So again, it's an old-fashioned approach, but using new technology to help support it. Quality control, of course, is really essential in decentralized interviewing. I happen to be a devoted fan of probability sampling because I understand the theory behind it. I think it's important to have not only empirically verifiable data, but to have theoretically justifiable data. And the inferential statistics tells us that to make inferences about a full set, we need a randomly selected subset, a probability set. And so therefore I remain in my company maybe a little stuck in the mud, but we are a probability sampling shop. That's also because of the really important work done by this Stanford professor named Krosnick and some of his students, which has been highly persuasive, and others, in demonstrating that non-probability sampling, particularly opt-in online panels, have non-ignorable variability within panel across time and across time in different panels at a single point in time. So we look for the evidence. We're not the kind of shop, I'm not the kind of guy who's going to cut his conscience to fit today's fashion. I want to know what's behind a method, why it should work, and I think that outcomes are important, but input is even more important in evaluating survey methods.
And over the decades, we've watched response rates in surveys decline in federal government surveys, in academic surveys, in commercial surveys. And that's partly a function of costs going up and budgets not going up proportionally. What are your thoughts about dropping response rates?
Well, so response rates, it's been well demonstrated. We've got a white paper on our website that looks closely at the literature. Response rates have been shown pretty thoroughly not to be a good predictor of data quality. What matters is not if non-response occurs. We know that it does. That's why one reason I talk about probability-based surveys rather than pure probability surveys. Purity is impossible. But the question is not whether non-response occurs, but whether it's random or systematic. If the non-response is random in terms of the variables that we're studying, then it shouldn't and doesn't affect the integrity of our estimates. In fact, it's within the theory of probability sampling. Only if the non-response is systematic do we have a problem. We have to keep an eye on it. We have to compare it as best we can to the benchmark variables that are available to us, think creatively about the comparisons to use. And again, you and your students have done a magnificent job in evaluating the validity and the reliability of both probability and non-prob samples, and I think that the outcome is hard to miss. It's really clear that probability-based samples are far superior. I only want to share with my clients, with their audiences, with our audiences, data in which I can be highly confident, so they can be too. And for me to get there, I need probability sampling.
And how do you feel as not only as a scientist and a journalist, but as a human being, when you hear people say, oh, come on, Mr. Langer, you must be kidding. Nobody answers the phone anymore. Response rates are tanking. We can't believe those surveys.
Well, again, I think rather than argue about your hunches or about your prejudices, it's best to look at the data. And you know, the data sets we produce in a great number of our surveys are archived at the Roper Center. They're available to look through it. And this is the critical piece in all of this, is what matters is not bloviating. What matters is transparency, so the research community can evaluate our data sets, yours and mine and everyone else's, and assess our research claims and see whether they're justified or not. I've been long engaged for a lot of years in the transparency movement, in kind of encouraging people to share their data so it can be open to the scrutiny of the research community. And frankly, it's the only way in which any data deserve credibility, if it's fully explained and exposed.
And for people who aren't familiar, can you describe for them what you mean by the transparency movement, and in particular APOR's transparency initiative?
Yeah, I kind of predate it somewhat. So again, I'm a newsman by temperament and training, right? I kind of faking it as a survey research guy. I'm a storyteller. I'm a database storyteller. When I think about journalists, where I started my career, the one thing that I think binds journalists together is a constitutional resistance to getting bullshitted, right? And as a reporter and pollster at the AP and then subsequently at ABC News, I found an enormous amount of junk data coming by, and in fact, in many cases, making it on air and making it in the paper because there was no checking, there was no evaluation. I used to say, and I think it's still true, that journalists, too many journalists, particularly of my era, have long indulged themselves in the lazy luxury of being both data hungry and math phobic. Any other alleged news comes in over the transom, we check it out before we report it. That's our job. If it's a number and a percentage sign, it's too complicated, I need it, I got to have it, I grab it and I run with it. And I like to say that running with data is like running with scissors. You're bound to get hurt. So the idea was, let's stop and check this stuff out before. What an idea, like we do with everything else we report. I went to ABC News Management and I said, we need a standards and vetting operation. We need a system in which any survey research being considered for air gets scrutinized for its validity and reliability. And where do these go wrong? Problematic sampling, problematic questionnaire design, problematic data analysis, in which we cherry pick and hide inconvenient results. And with the support of management, still deeply appreciated, we set up this standards and vetting operation, which survives to this day. An amazing amount of stuff that comes in when we call up the sponsor or the organization that released it dies on the doorstep because they won't disclose what they did. We need a detailed statement of the methodology, not some bland assertion that it's representative. A detailed statement of the methodology, the full questionnaire, top to bottom, with the marginal results to each question, so we can see how they did it, what they asked, how they got to their conclusions, and whether they're supported. This is basic reporting. For some reason, for far too long, surveys have gotten the bye, maybe because they're compelling, and that's kind of the beauty of our work, but we have to stop and check it out. And this gave birth to me to the transparency movement. First, I pursued it at ABC, where we had to have disclosure before we consider your stuff for air. I was involved with the National Council on Public Polls as a trustee there, and we put in the disclosure standards of the NCPP based on these same principles. I was engaged in 2 consecutive quadrennial code review committees at APOR, where we put disclosure into the APOR code, and most recently I'm a trustee at the Roper Center, where we put disclosure, much beefed up and expanded disclosure requirements into place. The Roper Center, we made a change. Look, if you've got non-probability data, you want to submit it to the center, do so. We're not trying to close the gates on this stuff. We're saying do so, but disclose, so your research claims can be evaluated by the community. That's what we do.
And so the APOR Transparency Initiative allows survey research organizations to sign on if they wish and pledge to live up to those principles. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of how well they are doing?
Oh, it's still problematic. I see violations of the code, the Transparency Initiative, I should say, by Transparency Initiative members on a fairly regular basis. I could be a cop, wear a funny hat and blow a whistle, but I'm kind of busy. But I think we all know we need to hold each other to account, each other's feet to the fire, and really dedicate ourselves and practice what we preach in terms of transparency. Another piece, though, it's not just about survey producers, news organizations, for example. far too rarely have enunciated survey research standards for what they will and will not report. I've got my standards, as we discussed, but I don't presume to set them for others. All I suggest is that you have some. Investigate what is and isn't, by your lights, valid and reliable survey research. Enunciate it, explain it, post it, and be prepared to defend it. Every news organization needs to do that. Any data consumer, any data publisher absolutely needs to get their head around what is and isn't going to be worth and valuable in informing their judgment. Look at the number of corporations that do junk research and make multi-million dollar or $100 million or $1 billion decisions that go to hell because they didn't invest in good data. That should be avoided not only by those corporations, but in all of us in informing one of the most precious things we have, our judgment.
So just a moment about principles and enforcement. In academics, for example, we are facing the replication crisis, so-called, whereby in the last 5 to 10 years, it's become clear that many published findings in many fields of science that we thought were real turn out not to be real, and that has created many quick fix solutions that some people are fans of, one of them being the notion of pre-registration, that before we do a study, we need to describe the hypotheses and methods of analysis that will be engaged and commit to that in a way that ties our hands in theory. The reality, though, is there's no enforcement mechanism. So we can submit a pre-registration document online and timestamp it, but there is no police force out there to check that pre-registration documents were followed, and that same principle to some degree applies to the transparency initiative with APOR. What are your feelings about enforcement?
Yeah, there's no policing procedure, and it would be pretty controversial. And one reason it would be controversial is because even within the research community, we don't all agree on what is or isn't valid and reliable survey research, where we should hang our hat, what is valuable information to share with our audiences, and what should be avoided. If we don't agree, I'm not sure how anyone else can or would, but what we have to do, therefore, is stake out our position, explain it, be prepared to defend it. I don't know that survey police are going to be highly successful. The better approach, an approach I learned working with you, with folks like Skip Lupia at Michigan, is this notion of encouraging review, peer review in the research community. I don't mean journal article review, though to some extent that can help, but I mean the opening of research claims to scrutiny by the broader research community. That's the only way we can do it, is if we, not in a punitive way, but in a constructive way, evaluate each other's research claims and report back whether they're supported or not. I think it would be great if there was some sort of academic institution that devoted itself to quality research and that helped enunciate these standards and helped create this notion of a community of engaged review in each other's research. That's where we need to get. And to get there requires the transparency piece we talked about.
Yeah, got it. Okay, before we talk more big picture about survey research, I have a more personal question for a moment. You mentioned management at ABC. Your career has been very different from that of many young people these days who are at an employer for a little while, and then they move to another employer, and then they move to another employer. And you have spent your career many, many years at ABC. And tell us the story of why not move somewhere else?
I'm slow. I've had 3 jobs in my career. I spent 10 years at the Associated Press. I spent 20 years at ABC News, and then 13 years ago I founded Langer Research Associates. So yeah, I'm a slow mover, I guess. I found the work, each job I've held, to be rewarding and fascinating and really rich and fulfilling. And I think the only reason to change jobs if what you're doing stops being any of that. But ultimately, after 20 years at ABC, now I continue to produce the ABC News polls, or a great number of ABC News polls, but now on an outsourced basis through my company, Langer Research. There is an opportunity that I saw, and again, I would encourage young people to look for what excites you, look for work that you find fulfilling and rewarding and that serves a useful purpose, and also look for opportunities. at ABC, I saw an opportunity to basically take that work. We had a little polling unit within the network, but a television network is not really about survey research. And I went to them and I said, look, why don't we take this out of ABC? I can sell you back the research that you need. It'll free me and my group up to do additional other work for others, which we have the capacity to do. It'll give you what you need when you need it, because that small unit at ABC was too small in tough times, in busy times, and bigger than it needed to be when there was nothing going on. And they went for it. So I took that opportunity, founded my own company. We've got, counting myself, 9 employees now, and having a blast, doing great, really interesting work. So looking for opportunity is another thing in addition to chasing your passion that I would encourage young people to do.
And when I watched you make that transition from having a salary and having health insurance that somebody else paid for to taking on your own firm, I wonder, was that scary for you at all?
I was a wreck, yeah, to some extent. Actually, I kind of cheated, because when I left, I took ABC's business with me. I had an anchor client, a base on which I could build a company, so that I was lucky that way. But additionally, there's something I did in starting my company that if anyone out there is looking to start a company, go your own way, I would encourage you to think about. Maybe I was mid-career even when I started the firm. A younger person, or a person with less of an anchor in what they do, may ask themselves, what product do I need to make that the market will buy? Whereas my question when I started my business was, is there a market for the product I want to make? I knew what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go with it. We do very little, hardly any market-based research. We're about purposeful social science research that serves a public good. We do research on complex public policy issues, political issues, on international issues, with a high degree of rigor. We produce, I believe, given the realities of the world, the best possible survey research product we can, and it's information and intelligence we produce that is intended to drive the conversation forward in a useful way. So it's a very purposeful line of work, and that's what's so rewarding about it. If someone wants to start a business asking people what's their favorite flavor of toothpaste, it's a different kind of approach. If you find satisfaction in that, go for it, but it's not what excites me.
And you said that when you were creating Langer Research, you were looking at a product you already had, and the question was, would somebody buy it? But the fact is that since you made that move, you have become an entrepreneur in the sense that you created Park. Right. So talk about that idea. Here's a product, maybe people would buy this.
So Park is really interesting. Park stands for Polling Archive. And this was a system created as a mainframe system in the 1980s within ABC News to organize its surveys. And it was really good to look up past work you've done so you could see what you've asked in the past and replicate it going forward. That was the basic idea. When I left, in the mid-90s, I oversaw the transition of the Park system from a mainframe-based system to a server-based system. When I left ABC in 2010, I took the rights to Park with me and transformed it and got some developers and transformed it into a cloud-based system. It's great. It encourages transparency. It also encourages efficiency and accuracy in our working with survey materials. Basically, it's a text-based search and retrieval system, and it enables you to look up any survey question you've ever asked a week ago or 20 years ago, grab it, see exactly what it is, see all the related materials, grab the questionnaire so you can replicate it precisely. I think it's a terrific tool, and yeah, it's been fun business to build. It's comparatively small business to Langer Research Associates, where most of our work is centered, but again, if you find something you think is useful, that really is helpful in your own work, maybe it'd be helpful for others too. That's where we went with that.
And who are some of the customers who have signed on to Park?
Oh gosh, so a lot of the big highly respected survey shops, NORC, the AP NORC poll has a Park account, Ipsos Public Affairs has a Park account, Kantar Consulting has a Park account, Harvard Institute of Politics. I'm going to leave some out, but we've got a lot of wonderful, we just signed up the ACLU. So again, it's interesting because it's reaching out now beyond the traditional research community into others, organizations that do extensive research and need a way to keep in touch with their stuff.
Yeah, and I would say from my own perspective that it's almost irresponsible not to use it, because anybody committed to serious survey research is going to be committed over the long term. And simply archiving a study is critically important, but it doesn't help you to build on what you've learned in the past. And to have an archive like that that's so user-friendly seems awfully helpful. Okay, shifting gears. The phrase fit for purpose, we've both heard it. You've said a little bit along these lines a bit. Could you comment on, where I think we both heard that phrase go from nobody said it to a lot of people say it, and what's your take on who's saying it and whether it's helpful?
Well, I've said before that my fear about the term fit for purpose is that it really means anything goes, and that shouldn't be the case. We should use methods that we've investigated, that have a theoretical as well as empirical basis, and that give us valid, meaningful, and reliable data. APOR itself has said, for example, back to non-probability opt-in online surveys, that they're not appropriate for surveys that seek to estimate population values, which I always thought was the purpose of the enterprise, right? So the answer is, I guess fit for purpose makes sense if you're really clear on and dedicated to your purpose. But if your purpose is not to produce meaningful, valid, and reliable survey data, you may be listening to the wrong interview. I don't know.
Got it. Okay. I want to talk about disruptions that you had to cope with, unexpected left turns you had to take. And I want to begin with COVID. None of us were prepared for COVID, but COVID had tremendous impact on survey research, but also on Langer Research Associates and your activities. Tell us about that.
Oh, you mean in the structure of the company? Well, like so many of us, I got up in the morning, showered, shaved, got dressed, and went to work for 30 years or so, and it turned out I never needed to do that. Our people, I've got a wonderful team working together with me. And COVID hit, and we all went home and worked from there. And over time, members of my team said, Gary, I'm getting married, I got to move, or I've got an opportunity to go live. And who am I to say no, right? You did a wonderful job, carrying us through the pandemic. Go for it. So our people, I've got a guy in Ottawa, sorry. I got a guy in Montana. I got a gal in Texas. I got another gal in North Carolina. We're scattered. And you know what? Maybe if you have young people working for you who need hands-on mentoring, maybe it doesn't work so well. But for us grown-ups, it's a wonderful model, and we've adjusted to it and adapted to it. So we're a virtual company, and it works just fine for us. Works really well. We chat regularly. We do Google meetups every week, and it's working out wonderfully. As far as the practice of survey research, the methods we use in the U.S., the modes, the telephone interviewing we're still doing at the time, and the probability-based online hasn't really been impacted. Much call centers went to home-based calling. As long as you're tied into a management system, it works just fine. We're really tight on quality control. Of course, the real problem, we had some projects that we were doing overseas. There was one in Southeast Asia that was delayed for months and months as we waited for the pandemic to pass and it to be safe to send out interviewers. But you adjust and adapt, and I think we've all gotten through it. Yeah. And
also, if I remember correctly, one of the wonderful things about COVID for social scientists was a recognition of how important human behavior is and how human judgment is critical in managing a public health crisis. And as I recall, the federal government came to you and asked them to play a critical role in that process.
Yeah, and this was great because this is a great example, I think, of the contribution that the survey research enterprise can make. I think people hear surveys and they think who's ahead in the presidential race, and there's so much more rich and important information we can produce and provide. Irreplaceable information that within the absence of survey research would not be available. The COVID-19 pandemic was a great example. How people are responding to this, how are they reacting, how are they acting, how are they behaving, what are they thinking, what's motivating that. We had a wealth of terrific surveys, And the question became, how do you get your hands around all that? How do we keep track of it? Well, we had our park system. We heard from the National Science Foundation. We set up the Sean COVID-19 survey archive. It's still up. And we invited, and I think this was really inspirational to me, we invited colleagues from across the survey research industry in the United States and abroad who were producing quality probability-based surveys to contribute their data to us, including down to the data sets. Very many of them did. We archived it all up in the archive, in the park archive. It's still there, searchable and retrievable. You type in the word mask and you'll get 718 questions that asked about masks. You can drill down, you can find the questionnaires, you can find the data sets, the analysis that was produced. Now, while we're doing this, because we've got all this data coming by us, we said, well, maybe we should do a little analysis. And we started writing a weekly summary of those COVID studies. Little did I know at the time this was going to go on for a year and a half until we finally got exhausted and gave it up. But we thought, a couple of months, you know, not so bad. It became a labor of love, but I think it was a contribution. But the real contribution was in all the research organizations that did such valuable and important work during the pandemic and understanding where people were at with this. And that's what we're all about.
And do you feel like that was a model maybe that should be pursued in other arenas? I mean, that was COVID, but you could imagine collecting and interpreting surveys done by many organizations on gun control or abortion or other issues the government's dealing with.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a fine idea. I think, you know, when we collect data on controversial, in particular public policy issues, we need to pay attention to the methods by which the data was collected, the survey modes, the questionnaire design, and include in our analysis what sort of data we're talking about, make judgments about what we think data are or are not valuable and worth exploring. And again, those sorts of judgments can be controversial. Say I'm writing a summary of attitudes on gun control. Maybe somebody done a gun control survey that I don't think should be included because it doesn't meet reasonable standards. But whoever produced it may want it included because there's a lot of surveys produced not to independently assess attitudes, but to promote somebody's product or point of view. And you can get into debates and disputes about that. So there can be, it can invite some argumentation and controversy, but I still think it's a really a useful exercise. A single survey, a single question on a survey topic within a survey, it's like a flashlight shining on the road. It illuminates a little corner of the road, but doesn't really show you the path ahead. We need a lot of flashlights from a lot of sources that help us see the way. And multiple surveys, and then evaluating them and learning. When we see results that too often a lazy analyst would say, we'll see contradiction in survey results. And we shouldn't confuse complexity with contradiction. There's an example I always use, I'll tell you quick. I've had many reporters come to me over the years and say, I'm doing a story on the death penalty. What's the number? And I'll always say, what would you like, the 69 or the 48? And they'll say, what do you mean? Well, I'll say if you ask people if they support or oppose the death penalty for people convicted of murder, 69% will say they support it. If you ask people what they prefer for people convicted of murder, the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole, preference for the death penalty goes down to 48%. That's not contradiction. It's different answers to different questions. Having both enables us to learn more. The way I explain this, I might say, John, would you like a cookie? And you'll say, yes, Gary, I'd love a cookie. And well, John, would you rather have a cookie or a slice of cake? And you'll say, well, now that you mentioned it, I'll take the cake. You haven't contradicted yourself. You made a different choice to different options. And keeping our eyes open to the options we're presenting our respondents with and then coming to grips with what they're telling us is really important. A poor analyst will often blame the respondent for being confused, for being inconsistent. And if you see something that confuses you or seems inconsistent to you, we need to recognize that the problem is with us, not with them.
So, would you like a cookie? Sounds like, here's the choice, cookie or no cookie. Would you like cookie or a piece of cake? That gives you the two choices explicitly. How do you decide which number should the reporter get and use?
Well, ideally, we can get the reporter to use both in a case like this. The job is not, in my years at ABC News, a place where there are about telling stories with pictures, as discussed, or numbers. My goal there was not to get numbers on air. My goal there was always to inform the judgment of our correspondents and producers so they would approach the stories they're covering with a deeper and broader base of knowledge that would inform their reporting and then in turn inform our audience in a better, more meaningful way. So my idea is not use the 48 or the 69, but understand where people are at on this and use that to inform your stories. That was always the goal.
Got it. So when you mentioned earlier Peter Jennings and how important he was, I assume part of what he did was to help you see how to tell those stories. But he was not the only voice, of course, on air talking about survey results at ABC. You did this as well. How did it feel to be on television, especially on election night, under pressure, numbers coming in? What was that like?
Well, I'm sure there's some horrifying clips of me stumbling and bumbling over why Donald Trump won the Electoral College. But I didn't spend a lot of time on air. I never really had the mojo to get on air. I was more interested in informing, again, the bottom line of where we're coming from in our reporting. On election nights, I do exit poll analysis. I'm not involved in projections. They take care of the who won, we take care of the how and why. But I typically, and during commercial breaks, will be prowling the floor, talking with the on-air folks about what we're seeing in the data and good ways to try to explain it and get it across. I think they're really excellent professionals in terms of being on television, and that's not my job. I can do it, done a little of it from time to time, done some radio over the years, but the one thing television has trouble with, television news has trouble with, is complexity. And therefore trying to smooth and iron that out takes enough of my energy that I think if I can get it across to the producers and correspondents, my work is done.
Yeah. And so if you're asked to do that kind of how and why analysis on election night, you're relying on exit poll data. Mm-hmm. You've seen exit poll methodology change over the years. What are your views of that history and where we are today?
Well, exit polls are complex instruments. I'm not involved in the production of the exit polls. I'm the analyst at the other end. I like to say that exit polls are done not by me, but to me. By and large, they have a good track record. The only thing worse than having exit polls would be not having exit polls. But again, I think we need to keep in mind the purpose of exit polls and of election polling more generally. And in my view, it's not to anticipate and announce who's ahead, who's the winner. It is a purpose of this work, but the how and why of it. Who showed up? What did they care about? What issues impressed us? What candidate attributes attracted or repelled us? An election, a presidential election, it represents the country coming together once every 4 years to assess and analyze where we're at, where we want to go, how and why, under whose leadership. These are really important things that in the absence of good quality surveys, we would not have any idea about. The only thing we will always know is at the end of the day, who won or lost. I understand that the horse race adds context and it adds a structure, but it also swallows all the oxygen in the room, and it's the only thing that gets paid attention to, and the work is much more richer and valuable and important than just that.
Okay. So as the field has been in the spotlight, it seems like the public's appetite for polling has been tremendous. One could argue, thank goodness, because when the transition of the news media into the new economic model online, where it seemed like a lot of stuff was going to be available for free and clicks were essential for making money, it does seem like maybe clicking on polling results is still attracting people. And yet there's a sense in which, even if the appetite for polling data hasn't declined, there's the public's view of polling may have changed. Do you have a sense of the public's esteem for what we do these days?
Well, the public's view of everything is fairly sour in a lot of respects. And there's some really interesting reasons for that I think we need to look at and understand. I think a challenge of survey research is in the public side, it really is tied almost exclusively to horse race polling. And I think it would really behoove us who produce meaningful public opinion research to try to help share the story of the value that polling brings, the areas in which we cover. You know, the unemployment rate, you hear it once in a while. You ever wonder, I ask people, where do they get that? Well, they do a survey, they ask who's working. Inflation, it's a basket of goods, it's a survey. The public health surveys that we see are absolutely invaluable. The monitoring the future and the surveys of teen drug use. You know, you're well aware. There's just an endless array of super important surveys that inform our judgment in unique and invaluable ways that are not about who may or may not win the next election. And I think to the extent that we can share the story with news consumers, with survey consumers about the depth and breadth of the work we do and move it a little off this focus on horse race polling and elections, it'd be good for us and it'd be good for the public's knowledge and understanding as well and acceptance of polling. So to the extent we're tied to election outcomes, it's a difficult and frankly dangerous game for the survey research enterprise to put all of its chips because of the challenges in measuring election preferences, which is not that easy a task.
So how do we fight that? How do we show the public that our data are reliable?
Well, you know, you've gone a long way to doing it in terms of assessing and reporting on unreliable data, but I think by their nature, surveys are both compelling, this is to news consumers, to the public, both compelling and off-putting. Compelling because we recognize that a survey, a random sample representative survey, is kind of like walking by a mirror in a storefront. It's really hard not to just check yourself out, right? It is a way we can see ourselves reflected as a community, as a nation, that is completely unlike any other way of doing it. We can watch the pundits and the soothsayers tell their stories about what people want and think, but we can hold their feet to the fire and independently know and assess this, and I think people get that. At the same time, it's off-putting because how can my opinion be reflected in a sample in which I wasn't personally included? It sounds off-putting. It sounds un-American. So I think you've got a pull and a push there. To the extent we can get the story out about the breadth and depth of the work we do, and to some extent in understandable terms about how and why it works, then we do ourselves and the public a good favor. And that's an effort. Again, if there were for example, an academic institution that was devoted to telling that story, I think it would be good. But I think all of us as researchers can devote ourselves to trying to tell it as well.
Yeah. So speaking of disruptions, there have been moments when very famous people have aggressively criticized your polling, doubting the validity of those results. Tell us about how that felt when that happened. What did you do to cope?
I have no idea what you're talking about. No, look, it's the world of politics is a rough and tumble one, and you have to have a fairly thick skin. You also have to be really confident in your work, and you have to get through it by making your work as bulletproof as possible, which we do by disclosing. This is what we did. This is how we did it. This is how we. When Donald Trump was running for president, we had a poll that he found favorable, and he excitedly tweeted that everyone should look at the ABC News Washington Post poll that had him up or something. Sometime later, we did a poll he didn't like. He called on ABC for me to be fired. Kind of like anyone else, he's basing his judgment not on what went into producing the results, but not simply on whether he liked or disliked them. But at the same time, we put out a survey at some point not too long ago that was not a positive result for Joe Biden, and next thing I knew, Biden's pollster and others working with or for him were fairly viciously attacking that survey. So it's without any justification. So it's not limited to any particular persuasion. It comes from all sides, and if you want to work in the field to some extent, doing research on controversial issues, you just got to do the best work you can and be confident in it, and let the rest wash over you.
Yeah, and to some degree, it's the result of being human. The research at Stanford in the psychology department and our group has shown that when you show people a piece of science or a piece of polling, if the result is one where it appears that most people agree with your point of view, you'll say, oh, great survey, I believe that one. And if it suggests that most people disagree with you, you're apt to criticize the survey. And in fact, telling people about the methods of the poll doesn't override that. The single best predictor of how much they trust a poll is whether the result is the one they want to see.
Sure. When I talk about this, I like to refer to the lyrics of a song written by Paul Simon, the singer, not the senator, 50 or so years ago. The Boxer was the song. All lies and jest. A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest.
Yeah. So can we do anything about that?
Yeah, do our best work and explain it as best we can and hope for the best.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about leaders in the field, people who you look at in the history of survey research and say, those were some great people who inspire me, and for young people in the field, they should learn about those people and look at how their careers unfolded and how they shaped what we do.
Well, I'm a little disadvantaged because unlike so many people at APOR who I've learned from and respect so much, I'm not academically trained, right? I learned this at the University of the Streets as a practitioner, which I am today. But one example, the acuity of our analysis is where we sort of stick our flag in the ground as a research shop. But questionnaire design is often the forgotten stepchild of survey research. It is so important. Understanding what we're asking and where people are coming from when they see it and respond to it is critical. And the Human Impressor book I found invaluable. How long ago was that now? Probably 35 or more years ago. There was published 1980, Questions and Answers in Attitude Surveys by Human Impressor, I think is one example of that. An odd response to that, if I may do a pitch to my mom. My mom's a professor of education, her PhD's in psycholinguistics, and she and I used to have, when I was getting started in the field, and even to this day, have talks about cognition and how people come to understand and think through our questions, how they answer what we're asking. It was her field of study, the subject of her dissertation, and her lifelong pursuit in studying the field of literacy that's been invaluable in my understanding of these things too.
And I'm glad you brought her up, because as an educational psychologist, the fact of the matter is that she was a model as a scientist for you throughout your life, and a very, very successful scientist at that. Did her career inform the way your career unfolded?
To some extent. It's interesting. So my mom's a professor of psycholinguistics, is educational theory and practice. I learned a lot from her in the creativity side. My dad, he's gone now, he was an electrical engineer and very organized and very structured in his approach to some things. And I think I took a lot away from both of those elements that inform the work we do now. A park is an example of a structured approach that is designed to make us work efficiently and accurately with our materials. That's my dad's stuff. The surveys we design and the way we craft our questions, the research we do around them, and the way we analyze them I think, reflects more of my mom's creative influence.
Lucky you.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, looking forward, what would you like to see change in the world of survey research in the next 10 years?
Well, I'm waiting to see what happens with AI. I'm interested in it. I'm a little concerned about it. I think it's got a lot of possibilities. In our shop, when we code open-ended questions, we're doing it the old-fashioned way. I got 2 coders coding up, measuring intercoder reliability. It's really time-consuming. I'd love AI to help us out with that. I'm concerned now that I can run a set of open-ended data through AI one week and then do it again a week later and get totally different results. It's generative, so that's problematic. So I'm very curious to see where AI takes us. At the same time, I would say I'm really personally interested in HI, human intelligence. I don't see that as easily replaceable. At its base, the research enterprise, to me, is about human beings getting information from other human beings about what they think and do. And the notion that we can do that with synthetic human beings on either or both ends of the equation Seems problematic potentially, but we needn't go overboard with that concept. Some will. We just need to think through how it can help us, how it can improve our research, and make sure that whatever experimentation we do with it, we fully disclose. So again, the research community can look it over, and we can all decide as a community what we think of it.
Any other things you'd like the young army of the future of survey research to try to do?
Well, I think a really critical, important piece to me, beyond being creative, beyond being thoughtful, is to be ethical. It's really important for us to, as researchers, data speak with authority. For a journalist, the reason we grab and run with numbers in news is because without it, we have mere anecdote. Right? It doesn't really amount to anything. So we look for structure from data, which humans have done since time immemorial. Data speak with authority. The writing on the wall, many, many, tekel uparsin, numbered, weighed, and divided. Therefore, we have a special obligation, those of us who work with data, to be really careful with it, to exercise extreme probity with it, to make sure that our research claims are justified, that the data truly reflect and support what we're trying to say and where we're trying to go with it, and that we're honest and transparent in our methods. I think that as a young person, when you're looking at new methods, fine, great to experiment. When you're looking at analysis, at question writing, when you're looking at any element of the many rich elements of the work we do, keep in mind where you're coming from and where you're going for it, and your ethical responsibility to be honest, true, and open about the data you're collecting and reporting, because it speaks with such authority. I think it really brings us to a higher level of responsibility that we all have to take really seriously.
Great note for an ending for this conversation. I'm so grateful for your time and your openness, and I've learned things from this conversation the way I always do when we talk. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for being who you are and for what you've done and what you will do. And I know on behalf of APOR, the organization is incredibly grateful for your contributions and your willingness to do this Heritage interview.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Indeed. Okay.